My theory as it stands right now is that Miki is actually Ken's mother. And that's it. Phew. Finally done with episode 5. Man, that took a while to make, but at the very least, I think that theory is rock solid. Man, I'm so proud of it too. It took me so long to figure this out. I'm so excited for the game to prove me right. Alright, let's just get right back into the game and... Oh! Okay. Okay. I'm done. Fuck that. Fuck.
2,000 years later.
Okay, well, I'm going to be very embarrassed presenting that, but that's not going to take away my resolve. And by resolve, I don't mean the software.
Oh my god.
But if this franchise has taught me one thing, it's that no matter the odds, you never give up. And thus, welcome back everyone. Time to talk about Persona 3 again. Hey and welcome back to the channel. My name is Ristel, you can also call me Ari, and you're watching episode 6 of my P3R review series. Yeah, I know, it's been a while since the last episode came out. I just had to take a break. I've basically been binging Persona games ever since March of this year, so I knew that the burnout was looming over me and I thought it was just better to come back with a fresh perspective. No worries though, I've had my fix by playing a lot of World of Warcraft and now I'm back. So I came back very confident, you know, like just ready to play some more Persona 3. And then I found out that my theory about Miki was just completely wrong. Yeah. Shocker, I know. Now, call me nitpicking and biased if you want, but my interpretation was a lot cooler. But I guess the writers just had a different idea in mind. That's okay. Nevertheless, we are just going to pick up the events from where we left off in episode 5, and the arc that I'm going to talk about today is a bit shorter than usual. In fact, I'm only going to be covering the events that occur between September 25th all the way up to October 10th. There's a reason for that, and if you've played Persona 3 yourself, you know exactly what I'm talking about. However, I do know that some of my audience is not actually familiar with Persona 3, and therefore I thought it was best to just issue a content warning before this video. I know it's a bit silly considering the whole game's about people shooting themselves with evokers. However, it is at this point of the game that the narrative takes a pretty drastic shift in how it's presented, and I believe that some of the subjects may be considered sensitive to some people within my audience. The topics in question are currently appearing on screen right now. Unfortunately, I cannot provide you with timestamps or anything like that to skip the parts that may be sensitive, because the narrative as a whole is starting to revolve around these specific subjects. So if there's anything on this list that bothers you or that makes you feel uncomfortable, I would simply recommend that you pause the video now and come back to it later when you are in a better headspace. Now with that said, let's head back to the usual format, starting with my review of this arc, and boy, I think we've hit the jackpot. I think we're starting to finally get answers as to where the story is headed, and I won't even lie to you right now, there was a scene in this specific arc that had me crying when I saw it in game. So yeah, I think at this point the story got me good. We'll be following the same format that I showcased in episode 5, meaning a story recap, and then we'll talk about specific characters. We'll discuss Shinji, Ken, Akihiko, as well as a fourth character that kind of piqued my interest. I'm not going to say who that is just yet, but you will see later in the video. And with that said, let's get started. Since the time frame for this episode is a bit shorter than usual, this shouldn't take too long. I still wanted to talk about the boss fight on the full moon that occurs on October 4th because it is quite interesting in terms of mechanics. First of all, two of your party members are missing, Ken and Shinji. This is now the second time that the game pulls that trick on you, and last time it was pretty relevant story-wise. Beside that, let's talk about the boss fight itself. It is against two major shadows, Strength as well as Fortune. The gimmick here is that Fortune is not a attackable in the first part of the fight, meaning that you have to focus on the other shadow first before you actually are able to defeat the Fortune Shadow. That doesn't mean that it is actually staying passive though, because every other turn, the Fortune Shadow will use a roulette wheel to actually buff, debuff, or damage you. Those effects may also apply to the Strength Shadow, so that actually can turn into a positive thing for you. Now, the interesting part is that at the very end of the fight, something weird happens. The roulette shows up one more time, except this time it looks like the odds are really in your favor, but no matter what, it will always land on that skull. And yet, nothing happens. It's like the ability didn't work. Now, the first time I saw that in game, I figured, oh, I got lucky, I dodged an insta-kill or something like that. But then I went back a couple times to see if a different roster of party members would trigger something else during the fight, and it turns out that this scene is actually scripted. This will always land on the skull, and it will never do anything to your party. Now, my theory here is that it's actually a foreshadowing of what's about to happen after the boss fight, story-wise. A very subtle way of doing that, to be honest, because I've really figured that I just got lucky the first time, and I assume most players would probably only do this fight once, not like me. Once the boss fight is over, you would expect this full moon to be just like any other one, going back home to the dorm and just sleeping the night over. But Akihiko will realize that something is off, and then it dawns on him. Today is October 4th. From his reaction, you can tell that something about that date stresses him out, and he decides to go look for the two missing party members. It is only after we get back to the dorms that Mitsuru realizes the meaning of that date. It turns out that Ken's mother, who we already know had passed away 2 years ago, died on October 4th. She immediately realizes why Akihiko seems so distressed, and we try and go look for them. And this is when everything turns tragic. You see, Ken actually planned this for a couple days now, and he had invited Shinji to meet him up at the station outskirts for a very specific reason. That reason being vengeance. You see, while my theory from episode 5 was wrong when it came to identifying who Ken Mothers was, I was right on the money when it came to figuring out what had happened to her. 2 years prior, Shinji had indeed lost control of his persona. It went berserk, and that led to the death of Amada's mother. Ken had lost everything that day, and while we don't really get to see what happened in detail, we know that Ken was a witness to what happened. Ever since that day, he only had one goal in mind: avenging his mother and then passing away to join her. That was his only goal in life. That was his only reason to keep fighting. And once he had recognized Shinji, he did everything that he could in order to get stronger and to finally get to his goal on that specific date. That confrontation is shown to the player through a series of cutscenes. Now, I would say this comes as a surprise, but as a player, you already know what Shinji is like. You already know that he's completely consumed by regret for what happened, and that he has basically given up on life altogether. But Ken is obviously not aware of that fact. He's not aware that Shinji is going to pass away anyway from an illness. So it shocks him to find out that Shinji is just willing to die like that, not even willing to put up a fight. That conversation, however, will be interrupted by someone else.
I must say, I agree.
Takaya was waiting in the shadows. This is obviously a threat to the safety of both Ken and Shinji at that point. We know that Takaya is ready to go scorched earth on Cease to prevent them from destroying Tartarus, and that's exactly what happens. Takaya draws a gun, points it at Shinji and shoots, after which he tries and interrogate the both of them to figure out who is our navigator, because he figured out that the only way that we are able to find all of these greater shadows so easily is that we must have someone that has powers similar to the ones that Shidori has. And Ken, realizing that his quest to avenge his mother is over and that he really has nothing else going on for himself after that, lies to Takaya and pretends to be our navigator. It is obviously in a suicidal gesture that he does that, but Takaya believes him nonetheless. He lifts his gun again, points it at Ken, and pulls the trigger. But at the very last second, Shinji manages to get in the way, shielding Ken from the bullet. This, however, will be his last act on Earth. Despite the effort that Cease put up, once they do arrive on site, it's too little too late. Takaya has already left, and there's nothing else they can do beside hear Shinji's last few words as he passes away in Akihiko's arms. I would say that this is the turning point for the story. We knew that we were risking our lives going into Tartarus every night. We knew that was a possibility. We knew that was a risk. But I believe that Cease at this point only imagined dying to the shadows themselves, not to the actions committed by another human being. Everything is in shambles in the days that follow. Shinji is given a eulogy at Gekukan. We get to see a scene where Akihiko goes up to the coffin alone, having a moment of reflection, one that will actually unlock his second tier persona, Caesar. While this is unfolding, Mitsuru tells the other members of Cease that there will be a meeting back at the dorms in the evening to discuss the Ken situation. Only when they go back, they find out that Ken has completely disappeared. He left the dorm without telling anyone. Fortunately, that fugue is very short-lived, as he comes back to the dorm on October 6th, having had his own revelation, which leads him to also unlock his tier 2 persona, which I'm not going to try and pronounce. You just have to forgive me for that. Now, story-wise, we basically covered everything already. However, the time span that we are covering today may be a bit deceitful, because the amount of character development that occurs in this part is just massive, spread over at least 3 different characters, even though I would be willing to argue that every member of Cease is concerned by what happened on October 4th, and their reaction is very important to set the tone for the rest of the game. So without further ado, I suggest that we take a look at that. Okay, so to be entirely honest with you, there is just so much stuff I want to say about this arc that I don't even know where to start. This part of the game is intense to say the least. So much so that trying to dissect it into an analytical framework would not even come close to doing it justice. When I first started recording for this series, I really wanted to take an objective approach to the game. Things like gameplay mechanics, UX issues, or just a badly introduced character, things that I could point to with evidence. But for once, I'd like to take a step back and do away with the usual structure that you've come to expect from my videos. This time around, I want to talk subjectively. I want to talk about how the plot made me feel, because I genuinely believe that this part of the game is not something that you can rate objectively. It's about how it resonates with the person that plays the game, and I'd like to go into that this time. I do have to warn you, this is going to be a lot of yapping, and I'm fully aware of it being the case, but as it turns out, just yapping about the game is probably the best way of showing just how much this story got under my skin. And who would be a better character pick than Shinji to introduce this whole segment? I find it quite incredible how attached I became to this character, considering the fact that he's only part of your team for a month, and before that he only shows up in a couple of cutscenes. And yet despite that, they managed to write this entire character in such a compelling way. By the time you reach October 4th, you should have every card in hand to actually understand his entire persona. You finally know why he was so distant the whole game. You know why he lives in the way that he does, why he chose to take the suppressants to begin with. You get to witness his connections to other characters, such as Akihiko and Mitsuru, which serves to anchor him to the rest of the narrative. But the most important thing to me, in my opinion, is the fact that you get to see who he actually is. Because he's a lot more than just what he looks like on the outside. He looks intimidating. And in fact, every interaction that you have with him in the early game almost seems to point towards him being a villain. But in that short month that you get to spend with him, you find out that hidden underneath all of that is actually someone that cares a lot. Someone who gave his own suppressants to Shidori just to help her. Someone who is constantly haunted by the wrongdoings of the past and who is willing to atone for what he's done. Someone that is willing to give himself up to Ken, but will also warn him about what he's about to do and the consequences of it. But most importantly, he was someone who'd never break a promise once made. Notice how much emphasis I placed on the word someone over the last couple of phrases? That's because Aragaki felt like an actual, plausible, relatable character, almost like an actual person in fact. And I think this is best exemplified in the final linked episode in its chain, which becomes available post October 4th. The setup for it is pretty simple. You go back to the dorms and you find out that his door is unlocked. If you choose to enter, you will find out that the room is mostly empty. However, if you are to look on the table, you will find that Shinji actually kept the letter that Mitsuru gave him, the one he needed to sign in order to re-enroll into Gekukan, meaning that his promise that he made with Akihiko and Mitsuru is one that he was willing to keep. And that speaks mountains of his character. Despite everything, he was still hoping to honor that promise, which honestly honestly was kind of a shock to discover in game for me, because while I didn't doubt him and his honesty, I just simply never expected this thread to be closed by the end of the game. After his passing on October 4th, I simply expected this question to remain in the air like that. Just another mystery for the player to fill in, to try and imagine what would have happened had Shinji survived. But no, you are given the answers to fully comprehend him. And while we're talking about the linked event, this is actually the first one that we get to complete. And as I've mentioned in a previous episode, this rewards Makoto with a new persona to fuse. In this specific case, it's Hellbiker, which does kind of fit with Shinji's aesthetic overall. And when I thought about that, that sparked something in my head. Because if you think about it, when Makoto fuses that persona, he is integrating the memories of Shinji into his own being. And that only makes him stronger. And that to me sounds pretty poetic. While Aragaki may be gone, his spirit still lives on. And while he's not here with us anymore, when someone passes away, we still retain what they taught us. They are still part of us. They already made an impact on us. They shaped us into what we are today. It is only when the grief makes us turn a blind eye to the death that that person is truly gone, when we stop thinking about them. And I'm sure that you're already familiar with the 5 stages of grief. But it's exactly true. If we stay in denial forever, instead choosing to ignore that death because of the pain that it causes us, only then is that person gone for good. And if we instead choose to face reality for what it is, not only can we move on, but we can also grow from that. And it is those experiences that give us resolve, the will to fight, to live on, to see another day. And there is no better example of that than Akihiko and his reaction to Shinji's death. So let's take a closer look, shall we? The more I played this game, the more I was able to identify what animates each one of its characters. Which makes sense, because I've seen their lives, their struggle, the resolve that fuels their tenacity. However, it is with October 4th that we begin to see the cracks in those carefully crafted facades, exposing their nature for what they really were. Nothing but maladaptive ways of coping. In Akihiko's case, that realization cuts especially deep. You probably guessed it, but this is the moment where I have to bring up Miki. Though one may rightfully ask, what is her role in this segment? You already know from the introduction of this video that she's actually his sister, which we know for a fact passed away 10 years ago during a house fire. However, Akihiko's retelling of those events did focus on one key detail. The adult who held him back, who prevented him from going into the flames and saving Miki. That sensation of utter weakness has never left Akihiko's mind. 10 years later, he still thinks, what if I had been strong enough that day? The thought now morphed into some kind of compulsion. I must get stronger. That is my reason to fight. If you take the time to read into Akihiko's character throughout the game, then you will spot this thought pattern reoccurring over and over and over again. But it'd be foolish to claim that he had a say in that. It's not a real choice, it's simply a rationalization which serves only one purpose, clinging onto the hope that things could have played out differently. That force alone could have been enough to save his sister. October 4th, then, serves as a grim reminder of how futile that notion really was. Since we're already talking about Miki, I thought now could be a good opportunity to discuss what happened with episode 5, and especially explain what went wrong with the theory I tried to advance. It took me a while and I had to shift through a bunch of footage, but I think I can narrow it down to these 2 lines specifically. The first one right here is actually kind of weird for me. Because for me, it is conclusive. I even went as far as to present it as an argument in my video. Reason being, it really sounds like there are 2 different people being discussed here. Now, the second line is a bit more open-ended, to be fair. While Akihiko's choice to omit his sister's name in that conversation did not feel natural to me at all, especially given the tone of the altercation, the truth is I do not have siblings. So yeah, this may just be my bias showing off here. There's one more thing I would like to talk about regarding this theory, but let's just put that aside for now and we'll get back to it during the Ken segment. October 9th is where everything clicked for me, as we actually get another linked event with Akihiko. One that does allow us to learn a bit more about Miki and what she used to be like, but this scene specifically, I would say, is impressively well written. That was the scene in question that actually got me to shed a few tears. Yeah, I find it kind of hard to pinpoint what exactly prompted that reaction out of me. If I had to guess, it's probably a mix of things. For starters, Akihiko being vulnerable. Come to think of it, this may be the first time that we've seen him lose his composure at all. But on top of that, I feel as though this is the first event that feels completely genuine on his part. But the cherry on top with this scene is the recreation of a ritual that he used to have with Mickey back at the orphanage. Take everything you know about him into account. This is a man who has been suppressing those memories for over a decade now. Him going out of his way, taking the initiative, sharing it with the rest of SEAS shows that there is some kind of progress on his part. And that, in my opinion, is what sells this entire event. Because in reality, mourning, grieving, those are things that don't happen overnight. It takes a very long time for someone to heal from that. But in video games, we are often accustomed to characters that simply overcome and surmount these types of challenges in the blink of an eye. That pain being processed and turned into something greater, suddenly manifesting into power or something like that. Yet instead, the writers offered us a realistic, down-to-earth representation of that long journey that is grief, of which Akihiko has clearly just embarked on, and that serves to humanize his character, perhaps even explaining why this one event was so memorable to me. Shifting our focus onto Ken now, we can see that his character growth also mimics Akihiko's. However, despite the fact that we are dealing with another maladaptive coping mechanism, the expression of said mechanism is completely unique to each character. Akihiko's was mostly oriented towards self-improvement, whereas Ken is mostly about anger, revenge, hatred. Now, I don't really think that we need to look too much into Ken's character here, as a lot of it would come down to the same things we've already discussed in the previous segment, but also because I kind of realized something as I was working on this episode. It kind of occurred to me that these mechanisms all work in different ways. It's also very important to know that Shinji also had his own maladaptive way of dealing with things. His way was more about self-destruction. Now equipped with 3 different examples to dissect, I was able to fit them into 2 distinct categories, these being the finite and the infinite mechanisms. In order to explain what I mean, I'll take the example of self-destruction first. Looking at self-harm and self-destruction, we can see that there is an evolution over time, and once you reach the paroxysm of it, it leads to the death of the person that's suffering from it. That is to say that this kind of coping mechanism has a shelf life, in other words, a natural endpoint, therefore making it finite. With that in mind, we can also recognize that hatred also follows the same pattern, because it can only be sustained as long as there is something to hate, which is something that we get to see demonstrated in game. Ken just wanted to avenge his mother, but there would be no happy ending after that, because the next move he had planned was to simply end his own life. Clearly an example of a finite mechanism. That contrasts with self-improvement, which doesn't have a natural endpoint, because in theory there is no limit to it. You could always aim for bigger, for better, for being stronger. It would be foolish to say that this is a better way of coping though, because the obsession will not go away until you deal with the underlying problem. If you're unable to address the trauma that led to it, it is more likely that you will end up in some kind of infinite loop, never finding satisfaction with the progress that you do make, resulting in some kind of endless loop. And that explains why I picked those 2 categories to fit these types of mechanisms into, which I believe will become even more relevant as we'll see more and more characters fit into one of these 2 categories. Although I believe that there is one outlier to this, which we'll be discussing in the next segment. Besides that, there isn't much I can say about Ken just yet. I think the contrast between him and Akihiko is what makes this arc so interesting. Perhaps we'll see more progression on his side after his next linked event. So that's pretty much it, and let's move on to the next. Hold it! Yeah, not quite. Turns out I have some criticisms I wanted to share. I already kind of hinted at that in the previous segment, but the fact that my Mickey theory is wrong doesn't just annoy me because, well, I'm just that amazing and my massive ego cannot stand the fact that I was proven wrong. But because my theory allowed us to know the identity of Ken's mother, and without it, we are left with a massive hole in the scenario. Think about it, this one character is so crucial to the story that her death is what led to the events of October 4th. Without her death, Ken would not even be a part of SEAS today. Shinji wouldn't have turned to suppressants either. And yet we know nothing about her, not even her name. Perhaps that will be explained in a future linked event or something like that. But for now, that just remains as a gap where we don't even know who that person was. Yet pretty much everything revolves around her during this part of the game. So that was issue number 1, but there are a couple more things I wanted to say that mostly revolve around the writing and the way that Ken is handled in the story. While we get to witness Akihiko going through a natural progression of his grief, it feels as though Ken was kind of rushed out. Again, perhaps we'll see more developments in a future linked event. All I can say is that thus far his grieving process is quite streamlined. Him deciding to leave the dorms, for example, that only lasts for a single day. All it takes is one conversation with Akihiko to convince him to come back. And despite the fact that you get the chance to walk Koromaru with him on the 10th, all you get out of that is an apology for having run away and caused worry to everybody else. Speaking of apologies, you never hear him say anything about October 4th. I mean, he is kind of responsible for what happened to Shinji, but what I find really weird here is the fact that no one at the dorms seems to even mind. An event of this sort should cause a lot of turmoil within SEAS, but no one is mad at Ken for what he did. You don't see any kind of resentment or anything like that. Now, I believe that there's a simple explanation for all of this. Most likely the writers didn't want to push this character too far. At the end of the day, he's just a kid. His backstory is already tragic enough as is. Add that to the decision of portraying him as being suicidal, and you end up with a character that may be quite shocking to an audience, as well as running the risk that his trauma may overshadow any other character in the game. With that perspective in mind, it does make sense why they wouldn't want to add another layer of stuff on him, with members of SEAS being resentful towards him or holding grudges. I do think it comes with a side effect of flattening the emotional weight of that character as a whole, but I can understand why they would choose to streamline his character a little bit and give him some breathing room. Okay, and with that said, we basically talked about everything I wanted to, for real this time, but we still got one more subject to discuss in the next segment, and that one I find to be quite interesting, so stay tuned. What I find to be very interesting within this arc though, is that it really showcases how everybody reacts in different ways when faced with that kind of loss. A good example of that is Junpei's reaction during the eulogy, with him getting frustrated and lashing out at other students. I wouldn't say this is out of character for him, at least it didn't really strike me as such, but it is made clear how much this affects him. And anger is a very typical emotion that you see in people that are grieving. Now on the other hand, we also have reactions that do not make any sense with the character themselves and their personalities. I'm not saying that they're badly written, I'm just saying that they are complete opposites of what you would expect from that character. One example of that is Fuka. I mean, she's our navigator, so we expect her to be analytical, to take the time and figure out a strategy in order to deal with a problem. But when Ken goes missing, that goes completely out of the window. She starts to panic, she wants to find Ken immediately, having to rely on her teammates to realize that she doesn't even know where to search for him. She's desperate to regain some kind of control over the situation, which pushes her to act in very erratic ways. This is anxiety, this is fear, which while it is not uncommon to see that kind of behavior within someone that is currently mourning, it's very interesting to see how contradictory it is to her character, and how it sets her apart from the other members of SEAS. Now, I thought it was pretty interesting that Aegis also had her own reaction to all of this. Considering that she's a robot and she's still trying to process what humans are like, it's after this event that she starts showing traits of humanity in a way. Ever since the beginning of the second semester, Makoto gets the chance to interact with Aegis in the classroom after the school day has passed. Every time you do so, Makoto would just comment on the fact that she doesn't look human enough just yet, and that interacting with her further is not going to lead to anything. However, after Shinji's death, you can actually see that she's feeling something. Obviously, it's still very far off from what other people feel, but it's a spark of humanity that you can see within her, which starts at this point of the game. And there is a specific hangout where you go out and walk Koromaru with her, where you can see that she still ponders as to what death means, still trying to understand why everybody's feeling sad and what she's feeling inside. All of that to say that every member of SEAS is impacted in some way. Yet there is a clear contrast between members of SEAS and the students of Gekukan. It's already made quite obvious during the eulogy scene, with the students worrying more about the tests coming up rather than the death right in front of them. And what I find particularly striking here is that if you go around Gekukan and talk to random students, most of them don't seem to care that much. And I'm not implying that they don't care because they're bad people, but they are preoccupied with different things, instead choosing to worry about the test coming up next week, or trying to somehow rationalize what happened to Shinji, coming up with assumptions that he must have just been a thug, spending his time around bad crowds. Even though the topic of death could not be more in their faces, what you don't see within the other students is some kind of perspective on their own lives, some kind of reflection, which, if you actually take the time to think about it, is quite a realistic portrayal of how people tend to react. In fact, it's probably the most omnipresent way that you see people react to death. Whenever you read about tragic events happening or hear about it on TV, people often take the same kind of blasé attitude towards towards it, we are very quick to simply discard it, move on, because it's so much easier not to think about it. We're just too worried about our own issues, like the test coming up. It's simple, but the game actually taking the time to portray that makes that death feel even more real, even more impactful, because we are on the other end of it. We are a part of the people that actually have suffered from that death, the small group of individuals that have seen it firsthand, and now that are forced to grieve and mourn it. Now, while it is sensical for that contrast to exist between the general public and Cease, if you remember what I said at the beginning of the video, there is one more character I wanted to talk about here, because there's one person that actually doesn't react in the way that I would expect them to. And that person is Makoto himself. Now hold up, I know what you're thinking. Ristel, what the fuck are you talking about? You're playing an RPG. This is obviously just a case of a silent protagonist, which is a narrative trick that allows the player to never feel disconnected from the character that they're playing within the game. By keeping the character silent, you also allow the player to fill in the void with their own emotions. And while that's a good point, I actually believe that there's a little more going on here than meets the eye. Now, this may very well be another Mickey situation. Still, I found that to be quite peculiar, so I wanted to just bring it up here. You see, there are two main types of silent protagonists in RPGs. The first one I would call the blank state character, which is typically the kind of character you would play as in Skyrim. These do not come with any kind of predetermined backstory, and the player is given complete freedom to shape their character in whichever way they want. On the other hand, the second type of character has a backstory, but usually remains silent throughout the game to allow for the player to identify with them better. This is of course the format that you see in Persona games. But if you think about it, the way that these characters are introduced are completely different, because the player is given so much information about Ren and his backstory as soon as they start the game. But when you take a look at Makoto, you realize that you don't actually know that much about him. There are so many pieces just missing. Sure, we do know that he lost his parents and that something happened 10 years ago, but everything is so vague. And what makes this quite ominous is that there is one character in the game that is shown to know more about Makoto than we do, and that character is obviously Pharos. If you remember all the way back in episode 3, the theory that I proposed back then was that Pharos could have been some kind of inner child. Now, the game has yet to provide me with information that could disprove or prove that theory, but it is clear that Pharos and Makoto are deeply intertwined. And when taken as such, there is one scene that happens between the two of them right after October 4th that I find to be suspicious. Let's not forget that Pharos is assigned the Death Arcana, and if we choose to take that information as literally as possible, then that sentence right here takes a whole different meaning, doesn't it?
This is tearing me up. Could it be that you can't accept me for who I am?
Do I even need to explain why that sentence is so relevant in this context? Every single member of Cease, including Aigis, have shown themselves to be affected by the loss of Shinji. Yeah, I would describe Makoto as being completely frozen in time. Beside that one interaction at the eulogy, where you get the option of saying something a bit aggressive towards another student, he just doesn't seem that fazed about what happened, which happens to be yet another type of coping mechanism that we haven't seen thus far. You could label it as stasis, in which a person refuses to look at the past, but also doesn't project themselves into the future, giving the impression that they are just following the waves, living their lives without really taking agency for it. Now, when I mix the story being presented in this arc, as well as the way that the tier 2 personas are being unlocked for each party member, I can only assume that the story is headed towards each party member finding out some kind of way to navigate the grief that they've experienced in the past. The first contender in my mind would be Yukari, as she has yet to reconcile with the fact that her father is responsible for the creation of Tartarus. But when it comes to Makoto, we still don't really know anything about him. In fact, I would be willing to say that we know just as much as we did at the very beginning of the game, which to me sounds like a lot of repression going on, which in a world where coming to terms with that trauma is actually the way that you move forward, may end up being a problem for him down the line. Now, obviously, this is not enough proof to come up with a definitive answer as to what happened to Makoto and to where his story is headed, but I think that as the world around him makes more sense to us, eventually we'll have the pieces necessary in order to comprehend him better. And with that said, I think I've basically covered everything I wanted to talk about in this video. I've tried something completely different this time around. I hope you liked it. If you did enjoy this new approach, then please leave a comment down below. That would really help me out. Also, like and subscribe if you haven't done already. And I hope to see you again, hopefully before 2026. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. And that's the clip. Oh my fucking god, I can't believe I finally did this. Ah! It only took me 3 months! Let's go! Mom, get the camera! Mommy!